like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay our respect to the elders past, present and future. We also have some important guests with us today. Of course, we have our good friend, the Consul General from Turkey, is down here in the front row, and thank you very much. He's always been a keen supporter. I know that we also have, sorry, get my glasses on, Arati Shroff, the Regional Policy Head from the US Consulate General. We have the former member for Reid and Werriwa, Laurie Ferguson, is also in attendance. And I know that we have many people here from community organisations that are come. I know we have Jasmina from START, so we have people from some of the universities, and we have people from other community organisations. So I'd just like to welcome you all here, and then I'd like to introduce our panel to you today. So our panellists, firstly is Associate Professor Michael Clark from the University of Technology, Sydney. So I'm sure everyone knows Michael. Michael indeed has written a book, edited a book called The Xinjiang Emergency, which is an important book. And some of our other panellists have also contributed to that book. And one of those panellists was Dr. Anna Hayes, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at James Cook University. We also have Omar Kanat, the Chair of the Executive Committee of the World Uyghur Congress. Omar Bakri, he's a concentration camp survivor and witness. And Sېdnىيدىكي sorry if I got that wrong, is also a concentration camp witnesses. So some people that have been on the ground and have experiences and some managed to get out of that situation are here with us today, fortunately. There were some organisations that have also been important in jointly organising the event. Of course, the Australian Uyghur Association, the Australian Uyghur Tangata Women's Association, the East Turkestan Australian Association, the Uyghur Association of Victoria, and the Stop Uyghur Genocide Australia. So thank you to those organisations that have also lent their support to this panel discussion today. Now, panel discussion will be led by Professor Michael Clark as the moderator. He, of course, is a visiting fellow at the University of Technology, Sydney, and has significant experience in this area. So I will hand over to the panel who will, and to Michael. There will be opportunity for questions and answers later, and we have some roving microphones here, as well as, of course, this microphone up here for answering questions. So thank you, everybody, and welcome to the New South Wales Parliament.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Michael Clark from yes. And very pleased to be here with and so to begin with, just a quick rundown of I think our approach today. We'll begin with our survivors to give us their views and share some of their experiences with us, and then we'll proceed through the panel to myself and Anna, and with Omar we'll conclude with some remarks about, I suppose, where to now, I think, for some of the advocacy issues that confront the Uyghur community. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Omar, who wants to go first.
Salam hanımefendiler.
Good morning, everyone.
Ben 5 yıl burunki bugünkü günde Nayra'dan çıkıp hatta mağanmasdan iki bilekimden yetlep sanın düğü ekip koygan bir gün.
5 years ago today, I was chained and I couldn't walk. They brought me to my sister's house.
Atanmış ulanıkı nakşı etip, usul oynap, kesip ötülüğen bu mektebi normal bir mektep olmasından belki hakiki bir ölüm lageri.
These camps that the Chinese government has been portraying as re-education centers it's not re-education centers, they're death camps.
2017'de 3. ayının 26. günü kanunsuz kovalama edilip bütün bedenlerimizin ve organlarımızın tepsili 3 saatten artık taşıyışını ötküzüp özünün saçı idaresi apırıp kanap taşıdı.
In On 26th of March 2017, I was taken by the police I was tortured and taken by the police for a thorough medical examination for 2-3 hours.
Benim Kazakistan vatandaşı buluşumuna karmasın 4 keç gündüz en vahşi insan kılığından çıkan halette kıyım kıstaklığa aldı beni.
Despite the fact that I was a Kazakh citizen, I was taken to be tortured for 4 or 5 days.
Yolbas orundaki bağlaş, top kaltaklarından erkil ezalarımızla sancış, yavaş kaltaklardan vuruş, kauçuk kaltaklardan vuruş, hatta torusla is koyup cinsi ezalarının derslerine tıkış. Bunun da vahşisi, yolbas orundaki bağlar halette tırnaklarımızla yığınlarına tıkıp kıyınışı adamın cümle yaman eşitliyordu.
They used the worst methods of torture during the interrogations, including the tiger chair, electric baton. They would hang us as well, and they would use different tools to insert in our private parts. And the worst of all, they would insert nails in our finger.
Bundan keyin bizni 4 metr egizlikli tam bilan qo'rshilgan, tamning ustida yuqorisining toksinlar bilan qo'rshilgan, atalmish tarbiyalash markazi yana o'limlarga atbadi.
Then they would take us to a camp, a death camp.
Men 40 inson bilan bir kameraga qamaldim. Hamma qamalgan insonlarning tutqulidan menikiga o'xshash zanjirlab tashlangan holatda qamab tashlandim. Bog'lab tashlagan.
None of us could stand still. We were all chained like this, and the chains weighed between 7 to 8 kilos.
Bizni uning ichida kesib etini o'rgatmasdan, aksicha bizni o'sha vaqt o'tkazish uchun bizni osh qo'yish va har xil tan jazolari berish bilan xo'rlab bizni bek izzatdi uning ichida. Xo'rlaydi.
They did not re-educate us. All they did was leave us hungry and torture us using the worst methods.
8 ay yaranamga bir qatim mo'jiza tushib baxmadik uning ichida.
During the 8 months that I spent there, I have not showered once.
Bir qatim bergan tamoqqa bir tal gornan va guruch suyi.
All the only food that they provided us was a Chinese bun and some watery rice soup.
Her haftada bizni uning ichidan 16 yoshdan 40 yoshgacha bo'lgan insonlarni g'ayb ülkep ketadi boshqa joylarga.
Every week there were transfers. They would take some detainees and they would bring new ones.
Sizlar o'ylab qo'yishingizlar mumkin, bular biror jinoyat bo'lmasa, egib qolmaydi. Kasbi yo'q, tili yo'q insonlar bo'lishi mumkin deb. Yo'q, unday emas. Men bir shirkatning direktori, ya'ni Qozog'istondagi Tomar Taranis ismli bir sayohat shirkatining muavin direktori, 4 tilda so'zlaydigan bir inson.
You might ask what crimes these individuals have committed. These individuals were all innocent. I myself was the director of a tourism company.
Bunun içinde men bilan bilayotgan insonlar muallim Tahir muallim, advokat Ataullah, ve milyoner Ablacan Avut, çok savdogarlar. Her sahadagi şu doktorlar hatta bu yerda bütün Uyghur ve Şarkistan halkındaki en sarkılarını bile yaptım ben onun içinde.
The people I was interned with were professors, lawyers, businessmen, CEOs, doctors. They were the elite of the Uyghur society.
Ben bir Şarkistan'da doğulan bir insan bulup kalmadığım üçün de aşılayarlarda 8 ay azap ve horluk koyucurdum.
I was detained only because I was born in East Turkestan.
Xitoy xalqaro bizni terrorchi, bular terrorchilikqa va terrorchilik tashkillagan va terrorchilarni qo'g'digan va shuni tashviqot qilgan degan batnomani chopdi. Shuni imzo etishga majburlagan, ammo biz uni qo'l qo'ymadik.
The Chinese government claimed that we were terrorists, that we were aiding terrorists, and they forced us to sign confessions.
Ular bizdeki bu so'zlarni yolg'onga chiqardi. Bizning har bir kunimiz, har bir sekund, minut turguncha har uyning ikki burchda ikki videosi bor, video kamerasi bor. Zallarda har 10 metr birdan kamera bor. Kecha kunduz bizning bu iliqlik. Ajiba, agar bizning deganlar yolg'on bo'lgan bo'lsa, Yarım saatlik videonu xalqaro ko'rsatib, mana bu Ömer efendim yatgan lager undaq emas, yolg'on so'zlar degan bo'lsa, kimning yolg'onchi ekanligi o'tirib chiqqan bo'ladi.
The Chinese government called us all liars, but we were surveilled 24/7. There were cameras in each cell. If they could release only a 30-minute footage, the international community would know the truth.
Bu yerdeki bu atkan bu naqshlik ve qirg'izchiliklarni dunyoga yayganligim uchun mening dadamni 2018 yil 9 oyning 18 kuni shu kampalarda o'ldirib tashlandi.
As a result of my advocacy and my testimonies internationally, my dad was sent to a camp where he died.
Onun içidimi Parmaylık Yunus Ablız degan bir kishini o'ligini so'rab ketganini o'z ko'zimiz bilan ko'rgan. Ya'ni qiyin qisqalarga uchrab tayoq zarbasidan o'ldirib tashlandi.
During my time in the camp, I have also witnessed the death of Yunus Ablis, who died as a result of the extreme torture.
Men xalqaro jamiyatning ham har qaysi davlat parlament ministerliklar hukumatlarniki bu fashist qirg'inchilik apparatlar hukumatlardan so'l aloqalarda bo'lsin, haykallarda bo'lsin, qattiq ehtiyot qilgan holatda muomala qilishini hamda bizda qirg'inchilik uchrayotgan shu mazlum xalqniki tezroq qutulishiga bir sababchi bo'lib, betaraf komissionni kirgizishga jiddiy harakat qilishni umid qilaman.
My ask from the international community is to be careful, not to aid the Chinese government's genocidal policies, and to be careful in terms of in their relationships with China, whether it's trade relationships or others, and not to become complicit in this ongoing genocide and to help end this genocide.
Bizim yer şarıga apriyde olan normal insanlara okşaş yaşaşma hakkımız var. Hem her bir insanın yer şarıdaki bu meselede özünün hak meydanı turuşu mecburiyeti vardır hesaplayın.
We too have the right to live in dignity, just like the rest of the world. So this is my call.
Köpçülük rahmet.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alwan, for sharing that with us. Now turn to Sadiqa to share her experiences with the audience.
Assalamu alaikum, hürmetli hanımlar, efendiler. Assalamu alaikum, suyumluk vatandaşlar. Ben Vatandaş Türkistan Ürüm şehirde ceza lagır şahidi kalbimizlik testleriyle otlu salam ve âli ihtiramlar olsun.
Good morning, everyone. I first would like to say thank you for coming. My name is Kalbinur Sıdık. I am a survivor of the camps.
Ben 2017 yılı 3. aydan 9. aygacha Ürüm şehri Sayvan rayonu Sanfangu tağının üstü kurulgan mana bu 4 qavatlik erlar kampusida 6 ay mecburi Xitoy tili ders o'tishga evatildim.
Between March to September 2017, I was sent to this man's camp in Urumqi, where I was forced to teach Mandarin Chinese to the detainees.
Bu binanın üstleri, korutanın tüpleri bütünlüğü topluluk sımlarla katlık korşalgan, hem binanın işi, koridor için tatip hərbi sakçılar, Kur'anlık hazır cengi çıktıgan halatta aşağıda buradaydı.
The camp facility was surrounded with barbed wire, and there were armed police officers all around and inside the camps.
Bu yerdeki tutkunlar kameralarda 30'dan 40'a kuruk smokның üstüde yatırdı.
In each cell, there were about 30 to 40 people crammed in a room, and they all slept on cement.
Ular her bir vaktamıqıga bir tağdın Xitay nomisi bilen kuruk şoğrusu içidi, hatta tuval çıkış üçün bir minutun vakit verilgen.
All the detainees were only fed a Chinese bun and a watery soup, and they were only given 1 minute to use the bathroom.
Men şu yerda 6 ay turuş jarayonida bular bir aqıtımı muncha kirib juyunib baqiliyor. Hattaki kunda so'roq jarayonida qiyin qisqa qilindi. Bularning qiynashning 4 xil usuli bor.
During the 6 months that I've spent there, I have not witnessed anyone take a shower, and the officials would also use 4 different tools of torture.
Yani elektronlu qalpak, elektronlu kaltak, elektronlu qalpak, elektronlu tümür orunluq, yani yolbas orunluq deymiz, elektronlu pələydən ibarət.
These tools included the electric baton, the electric cask, the tiger chair, and the electric gloves.
Ular sınıflara tutqunları muşundaq zincirlengen ve kişilengen halda kameralardan ömülep çıkıdı, hatta sınıflardan ömülep kameralar kaydıdı.
All of the detainees were chained like this, and they would crawl into my classrooms and crawl out of it.
Ben bu yerden insanların ki her düşen bir güne namelum doğru içidiğanlarını, ondan sonra hukuları bulanın kandallarını öz gözümde gördüm, hem nurgun ölümlerine şahit oldum.
Every Monday, the detainees would be fed, forcefully fed medicine, unknown medicine, and their blood samples would be taken. I have also witnessed many deaths inside these camps.
Ben 2017 yıl 9. aydan 11. aygacha yani şu Ürümçi şehir Sayvan rayonu Togun kurulgan Kızayallar kampusida 3 ay yerden ibadetim.
Then from September to November 2017, I was transferred to this women's camp where I have spent 3 months.
Bu kampı intayın gayet zor çoğun bulup, bu yerge 10 manga yakın Kızayallar qamal kılıngan, hem tutkunlarının %90%i 18 yaştan 40 yaşgacha.
This was a very big facility where there were around 10,000 women who were detained, and 90% of them were between the age of 18 to 40.
10%i 40 yaştan yukarı, 70-80 yaşlılar var.
And 10% of the women were between the age of 40 and 78.
Tutkun Kızayallar'daki çarşaf üstüler çürütülgen, üstüden mahpus kiyim var. Bularmı muşu 3 ay jarayanda bir akıtı mınçılardı jüyünü bakınıyor. Her düşen bir günü buladığımı namerlik doğru işidu, kanladıdı ve hukudurdu.
All of the women's hair was shaved, and they all wore gray uniforms.
Muşu doğrulanış jarayanda bu yerde Kızayallar'daki umum yüzlük adetler toxtaytırgen, hatta ki balı imitat kalanlarını sütür toxtab ketken.
During my time there, I have not seen any women take a shower either, and they were also fed, forcefully fed medicine, and as a result of that, they would stop menstruating.
Kızayallar bu yerde xuddi qamışlarda yaşaydı. Ondan sırt yana künde Xitay saqçılarının mecburlaşıda her xil so'roqlarga ilib berildi. So'roq jarayonida hattoki Xitoylarniki bosqinchilik uchrab turdi.
All of these women would also be subjected to interrogations during which they would be facing several abuses, such as rape and other kinds of sexual assaults.
Yani bosqinchilik qilish, navbatlash bosqinchilik qilish va undan sırt qo'lda elektron kaltaklar bilan shu qizaylarning jinsiy maqsadlarga tiqish orqali qiynashib.
There was also cases of gang rape, and the guards would also use electric batons to insert in the private parts of the women.
Ben bu yerda 19-20 yaşlar atrofidagi bir qizning qansirab 2 oydan ortiq qon ko'payib qansirab o'lib ketganligiga shahid oldum. Buni ishga harbiy zambilda biz ko'z oldimizda olib ketgan.
I witnessed the death of a young girl who was around 20-year-old, and she bled to death, and I saw her being transported out of the camp.
Meyli kampı lagırlar işçi olsun ve sırtı yaşayotganlarmı suç türmeler yaşaydı. Ularning saqchilarniki takliflariga besimli uchraylarda aholi komissiyalarının mushunda uqtirishlarga asosan bularni majbur holda uzuk soldirish tug'mas operatsiyasi o'tkazib turdi.
And also, outside of the camp's network, people were also living in an open-air prison. Women were also subjected to forced sterilization policies, and where they would be forcibly inserted IUDs or undergo surgery.
Bu uqtirish endi qizilgan, ya'ni 18 yoshdan 59 yoshgacha tug'ut yoshdagi qiz ayollar o'z belgilangan doktorxonaga berib, ikki xil tekshirish qatnashadi. Ya uzuk soldimi, ya operatsiya qilindi. Agar xizmatimiz moslashmay qolsangiz, saqchixonaga berib, temir yo'l o'tirsiz deb endi qizilgan.
This is a directive from the authorities indicating clearly that all women between the age of 18 and 59 were called to get sterilized either through IUDs or surgery. And if they did not cooperate, there was a clear indication of retaliation, including being chained to a tiger chair.
Ben bu şu yerdeki yüzlügen kızlarla okşar, 2019 ayının ahire, mana bu Ürümçi, Tensar rayonu, Çağlayan yerleşken doktorxonada mecbur tug'mas operatsiyasi qilindi.
I was myself a victim of this policy. This is the hospital in Ürümçi where I was forcibly sterilized in May 2019.
Bu yerda Uyg'ur qiz ayollar yonunda sirkada Xitoy ahliriga tegishli mecburligi cho'qmasini bo'ladi. Hem uyiga o'rnatilgan qo'shma tuqqanlarniki o'zini uyida turib shularning dafsanchiga qo'rqishga uchrab turdi.
Outside of the forced sterilization policies, there were also policies of forced marriages between Uyghur women and Chinese men. And there were also an official program where Chinese officials would be sent to Uyghur homes and where Uyghur women would have to live with Chinese officials inside their homes.
Aile yollaştırılan bu atamız koşma Xitaylar tutanlarga 5 yıl faydalı şaraitlar siyasette belirlengen yani 5 yıl birlik buluştu. Uyghur kızlarının yollaştırılan atamız Xitaylar koşma tutanlarga 5 yıl birlik buluştu siyasette.
There were 5 different directives for these officials who were sent to Uyghur homes.
Yani 5 yıl birlik buluştu dediğimiz birlikte tamak etiş, birlikte tamak yiyiş, birlikte yig'inish qilish, birlikte sayli qilish, hatta birlikte yetish.
This included cooking together, eating together, learning together, and even sleeping together.
Onun dışında yana şu yerdeki şu Uyghur halkımız her xil zavod şirketlerde mecburi halda kul işçi bulup bir yerlerde işleydi.
There were also forced labor facilities where people would be sent to work under forced labor conditions.
Ben 2019 yılı 10. ayda kızım Gollandiyada turdu, şu an vatandaşı. Kızımın bu yaklaşıcılığı ve özellikle Özbek milleti hem vatan kalkan muhacir diyen faydalı boğaçkan şu kamplarlardan geçip çıkarılan terlilik insanların biri.
I was one of the lucky ones to escape in October 2019 due to my daughter's efforts. My daughter was a citizen of the Netherlands, and the other reason why I was able to escape is because I had Uzbek citizenship.
Ama şu kamplarla azı geçte kalınıyor, şu halkımız aşağıda kırgıncılık uçuratıdı.
But today the camps are still there. The genocide is still ongoing.
Onun dışında gazetenin dehşet boğunu, şu halkımız Xitay'daki korona karantin sebeple özünün ailesi de aşkılı kırgıncılık uçurap uyulatıdı.
And currently, there are harsh COVID lockdowns that have been implemented in the region where people have been denied access to food and medical care, and as a result of that, they're dying.
Hatta ki ayrı küstüş öyle kıymetlidir. Hayvanlarını yaşap tuğulu bulmaydığı yerlerde şu yerde bu sokakta tohumlar başka bir yoldadır.
There are officials who are also being sent to their homes to monitor them.
Biz şu Avrupa'ya geçip çıkandığında tabi'nin kadar lager şahitlerimiz şu Xitay'ın dehşetlik zulmini, şu faciani hakikatimiz anlattığımız. Bunun delil ispatı muşu yılı 5. ayda açıklanan Şinjan Sakçı Hücretler'de tekimi eniq delillerdi.
Since we were able to escape, we have been testifying and sharing our stories in the international community. And all of our claims and all of our the information that we have been sharing has been confirmed in the recent Xinjiang police files leak.
Biz qancha davom etib anlatgan sari tajovuzchi Xitoy hokimiyati bu texnik kuchlanib, har xil takliflarni beryapti. Hattoki biz mushaq qechib chiqqandan keyin shu Xitoylarniki hijoblar orqali ularning takliflaridan qechib qutlanmoqdamiz.
Even though we managed to escape, we are not free from intimidation, harassment, and retaliation from the Chinese government.
Bu yer guvohdan bergandan keyin meni vatan qolgan yo'l tushunmay tuqqanlarimni soqchilar ekilib takliflar qildi. Mana bu 2021-2018 kuni Urumchi Tensar rayonida Bog'liq soqchilarning bizga emas soqchilar Livenjan degan soqchini ekranda adamning telefon ekrani ochib turib maqol takliflari.
This is after my advocacy. This is on 18 of February 2021. A Chinese police who called me on my sister's phone back home to threaten me.
Ahırda ben bir cezalı şahit buluş tutum bilen Muş Avustralya Parlamenti ve hükümetinden şundan ödülmen ki şu vatimiz Şarkı Türkistan'da kırılıp tüyesini azı kalan şu Uygur birlikte yardım kılışını ve Xitay'dan şu kelatkan, mecbur emniyet kuzatlarını kelatkan Suudi alakasını üzüşünü Amerika, Avrupa okşar kararlarını çıkarıp bizge yakın yardımda buluşunu şimdiden de ümit kılma hemenler rahmet.
My ask from the international community, from the Australian Parliament and government is to help us and save the Uyghur people and stop this Uyghur genocide. I also asked them to halt all of the imports of forced labor products from our region. And I also implore the government to implement laws just like in the US and the EU countries to take action and stop this ongoing genocide. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. It's very difficult for me to contribute, I think, to what is already some powerful accounts of what's actually occurring on the ground in Xinjiang, or the Uyghur homeland. I will just focus very briefly on something that Omar actually pointed out at the very beginning of his talk, where he said the Chinese Communist Party likes to frame what it's doing in the Uyghur region as part of an approach of counter-terrorism. This is countering radicalization and so forth amongst the Uyghur people. And it's very easy to dismiss that as simply Chinese government propaganda. However, I think that actually tells us something very important about the ultimate objective of the Chinese Communist Party in the region. And we can do this by looking at what Chinese officials themselves have termed the Xinjiang mode of counterterrorism, which is essentially about two things. It's about so-called predictive policing and surveillance, and again, Omar has already in his remarks touched on this. And the other element is ideological governance through rectification, so the rectification of people's thought, and how this relates to the ultimate objective in the region, which, in my view, is a form of cultural genocide. It is to make Uyghur and other Turkic Muslim ethnic groups, in a sense, shed their autonomous ethnic identity and become what the Chinese Communist Party sees as modern Chinese citizens. And we can see this in the way in which China operates this so-called Xinjiang mode of counterterrorism. On the one hand, you have the sort of classic strike hard or so-called strike hard policy, which is really, I suppose, almost a counterinsurgency-like strategy based on hard power, mass arrests, the use of force, and so on. The other aspect to it, though, is what Chinese police term the public security approach, and this is based on the surveillance aspect to what's happening in the Uyghur homeland. So we've all seen reports and verified reports about the levels of surveillance in the Uyghur region across all manner of areas, facial recognition technology, the use of biometric data, DNA sampling, and so on. All of this data is used by the public security forces to do what Chen Guo, the former Communist Party head in the region, termed comprehensive round-the-clock three-dimensional prevention control that ensures terrorists are caught before they appear. So this is this notion of predictive policing, that we can use all of this data that we gather to predict when and where a terrorist incident can occur. However, this begs the question, is this surveillance just about control? I would suggest that it's not. Surveillance is always a means to an end. For instance, the management or protection, in inverted commas, of those who are being surveyed, those who are under surveillance. So this is where the Chinese approach is quite revealing in terms of the endpoint of what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to achieve. And this is this issue of ideological transformation that's at the heart of the re-education system. So for the state, and this is directly from the Chinese government's own white paper on so-called vocational education and training in Xinjiang, which was released in August 2019, it said the state must not only deal with terrorist crimes in accordance with the law, but also must educate and rescue those infected with religious extremism in order to treat both the symptoms and the root causes of religious extremism. And this approach is repeated in a range of legislation and regional government regulations relating to so-called de-extremisation, which sometimes is translated as counter-terrorism in English. So, for instance, a focus on identifying so-called 60 signs of extremism, from compelling others to wear hijab, for instance, to wearing short pants or buying sporting equipment. So the objective here is for the state to define deviant and abnormal behaviour, which it can then rectify through re-education. So this is where the surveillance system is really the engine for the repression in Xinjiang, in my view. All of this data is used, aggregated, and the state can then categorize individuals on the basis of these various so-called signs of extremism, and then send them to various parts of the re-education system for varying lengths of time. So it's really the surveillance apparatus which is at the core of what's happening in the region. And this system is central to the operation or to the pursuit of the ultimate objective. It enhances control. Uyghur society is now penetrated by a digital and physical web of surveillance throughout the region. Surveillance enables what is often termed in academic context social sorting, this idea of being able to categorize particular individuals as showing signs of quote-unquote extremism. The bigger issue, though, is that these markers of the Chinese state, which defines as abnormal, is that for the party state, Uyghur identity itself is the source of what it defines as extremism, and therefore Uyghur identity is the thing that has to be transformed, that has to be remade. Therefore, this is the engine for mass repression in Xinjiang. And with that, I'll hand over to colleague Anna for her thoughts.
Thank you. So first I want to spend a little bit of time talking about definitions of genocide and the genocidal process from within the scholarly literature, and then I want to turn my attention briefly to the recent vote at the Human Rights Council. So for genocide scholars like Mark Levine, analyses of a genocide must recognise the existence of a genocidal process. It's repressive state actions and strategies that target a perceived problem population. So this includes things like marginalisation, attempts at forced assimilation, deportation, and even massacre. Now, Levine argued that the United Nations Convention definition for genocide is inadequate because it has a limited scope. And he cited Raphael Lemkin, who was the Polish lawyer who coined the term genocide, and he used Lemkin's more encompassing definition of what genocide was. And so Levine argued that the point of mass systemic annihilation, or what might be called physical genocide, it really cannot be isolated or separated from the years and years of, and decades it can be, of calculated events that precede that physical genocide. So according to Raphael Lemkin, genocide is a coordinated plan to cause the disintegration of the political and social institutions of a targeted group, and it can include things like the destruction of personal security, liberty, dignity, health, and even the lives of the individuals who belong to that group. Now, Bradley Campbell is another genocide scholar, and he also draws on that broader definition of genocide by Raphael Lemkin. And he argued that the definition of genocide should engage more deeply with aspects of social control and social life. And he also warned that as states become more elevated in status, they actually become, and as they become more extensive, they actually become more violent. And totalitarian regimes are more violent than authoritarian ones, and authoritarian regimes are more violent than democratic states. Now, in their discussion of genocide prevention, scholars Isabel McGregor and Devon Bowles, they identified that there's often a lot of focus on what are called the downstream factors that spark a genocide, because they tip an already troubled nation over into committing atrocities. But they also argue that we need to consider upstream factors. So this is things like poverty, lack of freedom, education, healthcare, environmental degradation, resource scarcity, those sorts of things, because they are the structural factors that contribute to the development of there being a troubled nation in the first instance.
And that then actually makes that groups within that population vulnerable to genocide. Now, in addition to this, Daniel Firestein has argued that the distinguishing feature of modern genocide is the way in which they are legitimised, as well as the consequences, not only for the targeted groups, but also for perpetrators, but also witnesses and the society as a whole. So when we think about China, we see that Beijing has long considered the Uyghur homeland and the Uyghurs as being a backwards population. This is a dehumanising term, and it is a significant reflection of the uneven social geometry that exists in the region, where the Han Chinese are considered to be the advanced superior group, while the Uyghurs are framed as being a backwards and inferior group. So this framing then has also been used by Beijing to legitimise state violence against Uyghurs throughout the People's Republic of China's history. So if we think about during the Great Leap Forward, which began in 1958, ethnicity and religion were singled out as being obstacles to progress and also reflecting backwards culture and custom. If we think about during the Cultural Revolution, well, minority nationalities in China were again subjected to widespread cultural and religious insults, persecution, and human rights abuses. It even led to targeted ethnic violence by predominantly Han cadres and activists against minority nationalities, and this further demonstrated the cultural divide between Han and Uyghur. Now, scholars like Gardner-Bovingdon concluded that the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, they demonstrate the extreme effort individual and state actors have deployed to correct what they perceive to be deviant and backwards Uyghur others in every facet of their social, cultural and religious life. And they also demonstrate the process of attempted social re-engineering inside of China. Now, since this time, of course, Islamophobia has increased, and the CCP now identify the Islamic religion as an aggressor. And so this has seen the legitimisation of state violence against Uyghurs by individuals and state actors. And we've also seen within that this Islamophobia is also used to legitimise the widespread arbitrary detention of the Muslim minorities via preemptive policing, which Michael talked about. And that's described by scholar Joanne Smith-Finlay in great detail. So she argued that preemptive policing has become increasingly indiscriminate across the region post-2001. It became particularly pronounced following the July uprising in Urumqi in 2009, and that this approach has involved a mass roundup of Uyghurs into arbitrary detention, which has increased radically in recent years. So the domain knowledge of the Chinese state is that the Uyghurs are a dangerous population, they constitute an enemy from within, that they are inferior to their Han Chinese counterparts, and this is culminated in what we are seeing now, which Adrian Zenz described as Beijing now seeing widespread, large-scale detention as being the cure for the so-called deviant behaviour of Uyghurs. So on that point, and with regards to the concentration camps, if we think about the role of concentration camps in past genocides, well, Daniel Firestein has argued that in the Nazi genocide of the Jewish people, the concentration camps in Germany, which began, they were first opened in 1933, they were an important stepping stone in that genocide. So the concentration camps in the Uyghur homeland really do signal the escalation of the genocidal process that has long been underway within the Uyghur homeland. So what I want to do now is briefly turn to recent events at the United Nations Human Rights Council, because as a member of the UN Human Rights Council, China is responsible for promoting and protecting human rights globally. But through its Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing is using economic coercion, inducements, harassment and manipulation to undermine the international human rights framework. And this poses a serious threat to the effectiveness of the Human Rights Council. So Beijing prioritises what it calls people-centred development over universally recognised human rights. Yet China's high modernist development at home frequently involves human rights violations, and it has a disempowering effect on vulnerable and marginalised peoples. And we've seen that in Tibet, also in Mongolia, and within the unfolding genocide in the Uyghur homeland. So in May of 2022, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, finally gained access to the region to conduct an inspection tour, but it was greatly restricted and quite stage managed. So it wasn't a free and open investigation in that regard. When she finally did release her report on that visit, the report stated that China's anti-terrorist legislation was resulting in serious human rights violations and possibly crimes against humanity. It also documented the use of ethnic profiling and arbitrary detention against Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities who it said were being ascribed a status of collective guilt by the Chinese state. And the report also identified the transnational reach of China's human rights violations, arguing that the Chinese state has been threatening and intimidating members of the diasporic community and has separated families, and it has severed contact within families as well. So in response to that report, the 51st session of the Human Rights Council considered a motion seeking a debate on the situation of human rights in Xinjiang. And prior to that vote, China's ambassador to the United Nations deployed wedge politics to divide member states, warning developing states against supporting the motion. He alleged it was a US plot and that they could be targeted next if they voted in support of the motion. Now, while the vote was close, the motion was ultimately defeated. And Beijing claimed this as a victory. They do this in the Global Times. They claimed it as a victory against Western human rights being imposed on the rest of the world. So those statements alone call into question China's suitability to be a member of the Human Rights Council, given that it objects to the human rights framework that actually undergirds the work of the Human Rights Council to begin with. Now, of the 19 states that voted against the motion, aside from China, all of those states have Belt and Road Initiative agreements. Now, of the states that abstained from voting, 8 out of the 11 have Belt and Road Initiative agreements with China. But I should make the point that after the votes were announced and following some criticism, Ukraine changed its vote from abstention to support of the motion, which made the final result 18 states in favour of the motion, 19 against, and 10 abstentions. So this vote raises the question about the extent of China's sharp power within international forums, and also the possibility of a Chinese-led bloc of Belt and Road Initiative states. So given Belt and Road Initiative agreements are not made public, it is difficult to identify the specific economic promises that may be jeopardised should states displease Beijing in international forums like the Human Rights Council. But if we think about the composition of the current council, of the 47 member states on the Human Rights Council, only 14 states do not have Belt and Road Initiative agreements with China, and one of those states is China. So given Beijing's track record in deploying economic punishment to get what it wants, and Australia has experienced that, Belt and Road Initiative partner states are more susceptible to economic coercion and may not be willing to support unfavourable votes against Beijing as a result. So this in turn seriously threatens the Human Rights Council's ability to carry out its mission to promote and to protect human rights globally. So this demonstrates the serious international repercussions of the localised problems in the Uyghur homeland for the whole world, and that's why the whole world should be interested in taking this issue seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for those thoughts. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Amar Khanna from the World Uyghur Congress to round out our panel remarks.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Michael. Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this panel. It is very difficult as a Uyghur for me to speak after the testimony of the camp survivors. It has been 6 years now. Our people are suffering under the conditions that are already described by brave camp survivors who are taking a very big risk, and to explain, to tell the world what's happening in our country. Now, for 6 years, 3 million, more than 3 million people are in these camps, still being kept in these camps. So we, and the worst part is we don't know what's happening to them. So in terms of whether they are alive or dead. And we, the most of the Uyghurs out of the country still don't have any contact with their family members. So when we hear this kind of story, so we go back and we close our eyes and think what's happening to our uncles, to our brothers, to our sisters, to our loved ones. So this is very frustrating that until now, the international community hasn't taken a very strong action to stop this madness, to stop this genocide. They talked about, told us what happened to them inside the camps. But the people who are outside the campus are not, their situation is not very much different. They are under surveillance 24/7, and as Tanbulur described, Chinese officials, Chinese Communist Party sent, according to Chinese official figures, more than 1 million Chinese Party cadres into Uyghur homes to stay with them, to eat with them, to live with them, and even to sleep at the same bed with them. So this is a very insulting for any human being, for Muslims, for us, of course, and also 1 million, according to researcher Edwin Zenz, about 1 million children, Uyghur children, have been forcefully separated from their parents and sent to kindergartens or boarding schools in mainland China and other places. And the worst part of the story is their identities have been changed, their names have been changed. We have footages of some children who even couldn't tell the reporters their real name. And they said, if I say my real name, the teachers will become upset. So that means they are already, threatened to they are not speaking Uyghur. So the Uyghurs are very frustrated and very concerned, and we are worried what will happen in next 5 years. It's almost six years now. 3 million people are in the camps, more than 1 million children separated from their families and indoctrinated. And in 5 years, when these children came out of camps, these boarding schools, maybe they they will not even recognize it. They will speak Chinese. Even they will hate their parents because they are already being indoctrinated. So almost 1 year ago, the Uyghur Tribunal in London provided its verdict that the Chinese government's treatment of Uyghurs is genocide and crimes against humanity. This determination of the Uyghur Tribunal has been shared by multiple governments and parliaments around the world. Australia is a global leader in exemplary democracy, must join in acknowledging their reality. Yesterday, we spent the day at the Australian Parliament pleading for stronger action to address this atrocity. So we yesterday during our meetings we heard that already for example the Magnitsky sanctions. Magnitsky Act has been passed last year, and this bill passed unanimously at the Australian Parliament. But recently, this act was applied on Russians who committed atrocity in Ukraine, but not Chinese criminals who has a big responsibility in this ongoing genocide in our homeland. So we would, of course, the Uyghurs would like the Australian government to the parliament to recognize the reality and recognize what is going on in our region, in our homeland as genocide. As I indicated, many governments, 10 governments and parliaments around the world have already rightly labeled these crimes as genocide. And Australia must join governments and parliaments around the world in acknowledging what is an indisputable reality. Justice starts with appropriately labeling the crimes. In Australia, we would like Australia to take strong action, especially to combat the forced labor. The Uyghur Forced Labor Act in the United States is a strong example. But without other countries taking similar action, they risk becoming the dumping ground for these products. And also Australia should sanction Chinese authorities who are carrying out this genocide under the Australian autonomous sanctions regime. This would allow a thematic response to both individual assets and forced labor goods to be addressed. So in the US, we have this Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and US administration already taken more than 120 different actions and imposed sanctions on Chinese entities, Chinese businesses, and Chinese officials who have responsibility in this ongoing genocide. And Australia, we would like Australia to follow what it is happening in the US in punishing the Chinese officials. And of course, we are we appreciate the Australian government's position in international forums and also at the UN level, because Australia is supporting the joint letters, resolutions regarding the Uyghur situation. But until now, although the US administration has taken more than 120 actions, Australian government hasn't taken any single action to punish the Chinese officials who have responsibility in these atrocities, and also to prevent any product tainted with forced labor from entering Australia.
Great. Thank you, Omar, for those remarks. I think we'll proceed now just to open the microphones to Q&A from the floor and to keep the discussion going. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll try to get a microphone to you.
Thank you, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the camp survivors, Mr. Ömer and Kalbur Hanım, coming all the way from Europe and giving us this very distressing experiences of them while in concentration camps. And I also would like to thank Dr. Anna Hayes and Professor Michael Clark, giving very detailed information scientifically as researchers, specialists in this area, giving detailed information about the situation. And I also thank Mr. Ömer from World Uyghur Congress, who have provided detailed information of expectations of the Uyghur people from the Australian government and the world in general. Anna Hayes has mentioned one point that the Chinese are like looking at the Uyghurs as being backward and inferior people. In that regard, I would like to mention something that about every 10 years or so, the Chinese authorities somehow do actions against Uyghur people to eliminate their intellectuals, the business people. I resemble it to a car, kind of. You take the motor, engine of the car outside a new car, the car is there, it is new, but it doesn't move. In reality, Uyghur people have a very strong culture, and probably it is the other way around, that they have taught culture and civilization to the other, to their surroundings. And one just last thing, if you don't mind, please. Sorry, I took a bit of time. Yesterday, we were in the Australian Parliament meeting some politicians. Some of them asked this question, and I found it a really interesting question, and that was, how were the interns, the people were chosen to be placed in like in concentration camps? And the answer was, if they were Uyghurs, then that is a reason to be placed in concentration camps. And also, how were those people, those concentration camp survivors, were able to leave leave China? And the answer to that was, as those two gentlemen and lady mentioned, they were able to come out because they were totally a foreign citizen. For example, Ömer was a citizen of Kazakhstan, and Kalbur was able to go out because she has Uzbek background, and she had a Netherlands citizen daughter who helped through the Netherlands Foreign Affairs Department to take her out, and with conditions. Thank you very much. I just wanted to provide some, even though there is no question in it, sorry about that.
Thank you very much. We were together with the camp survivors in Parliament yesterday, and hearing the same stories over 15 times yesterday and this morning doesn't make it any easier for us or any of the Uyghurs that are seated here. My question is to you, Dr. Clark and Dr. Hayes. Thank you very much for all the wonderful research and books and articles that you do. My question is, with the research that you provide, we know that as I work at a university, the readership is very niche. It's very small. We read with interest because it relates to us. My question is, with those research that's been put out, has there been any shift in the recommendations or the the key areas that you have highlighted, whether here in New South Wales or federally, because yesterday in Parliament, all we've heard was diplomatic notes. There hasn't been anything that has been promised. There hasn't been anything that we've seen. We move one step forward and 10 steps back. As advocates, this has been so difficult, and we had to bring the camp survivors into this country so that the politicians could hear firsthand their stories. And we were not given audience with the Foreign Minister's office, with the Foreign Minister. Yes, her office members were there, but herself did not have the time to meet with us, which was extremely devastating for us, because prior to elections, it was a different kind of note. As government, the note has changed, as we've seen with the Liberal government as well. So can you give us some sort of hope that there has been some sort of shift that we can look forward to and harp on and work on to ensure that our cause gets to the next level? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think what you describe is probably our experience as well, in that it's a slow chipping away. I mean, sometimes we're in meetings where we're told, you'll never know the outcomes of this. So we do have a voice to different people. I do know my work is read, and Michael's definitely is read. I think one of the things that we're able to do at the tertiary sector is every one of my students knows about what's happening in the Uyghur homeland. So all of those students then tell other people. And so that's been a very effective way of trying to spread awareness of what is happening and to counter the rhetoric that comes from Beijing, which is very convincing in Canberra. And there is a Canberra bubble. So that is a very difficult environment to work within. So I think advocacy takes many forms, and I honestly see really good value in just getting the word out to as many people as possible, and that's something I do in every subject that I teach. It will come up, what we write in different forums. We try and put things online on different sites where people will read it, because we're aware that that book or that article, they do have small readership. But I think it's trying multiple ways to get that message out. But it is similarly frustrating. It's a very long, slow process, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I support everything that has just said there. The big one is, you sort of noted about, the sort of very niche aspect to academic publication is, something that I think those of us who work on Xinjiang and Uyghur issues are very well aware of. I mean, a lot of us try to make sure that we can distill some of our latest research into things that are open access, that are, whether it's via traditional sort of media sources, op-eds for newspapers and so on. But it's all part of this agenda. Certainly from someone who is based in Canberra, it is about having ongoing conversations with officials in relevant parts of the federal government. I mean, this has been going on, like Omar has said, for 6 years. I mean, I've given briefings to various MPs, to various aspects of DFAT and Department of Defence, on and off for 5 or 6 years now, and it is this very slow process about getting that information into the system, and then having it filter up to the right people is the big issue, I think, and the advocacy of actually going and speaking directly to MPs, I think, is a really good way of doing that, because most MPs are not specialists of any sort in this kind of field, whether it be in foreign affairs or China studies in particular. So they're coming into this with very little information. So part of the process is being able to provide them with easily digestible, informed comment. And that's, I think, the big challenge over time.
First, I'm Halima. I'm from Australian Uyghur Counterparts Association. Firstly, definitely I'm very thankful to the camp survivors to come to Australia and give evidence, and through the evidence you already and from your research, Dr. N and Dr. Michael, definitely you know there is a genocide going on in East Turkestan. When we approach to politicians, a lot of times they say the determination should be done by UN, by scholars, and international court. We couldn't make this judgment. So what do you think about it?
Well, I mean, in my research, I call it a genocide because it meets the parameters of genocide. And I think increasingly too, Joanne Smith-Finlay wrote an article recently talking about how, scholars have increasingly come to the conclusion that this is a genocide. I think there's enough information now to put that question to the side. It's no longer a question. And a lot of the evidence of this comes from leaks from the Chinese government themselves. So the Xinjiang police files in particular, I mean, that's damning. And Beijing can't say this is a fabrication. I mean, they still do. But that's their own database. It's their own data. It's their own sources. It's their records, because they kept meticulous records. And I guess to pick up on a point, some of the people they targeted first were the cultural elites. And that's the standard process of genocide, is to take out the artisans, the linguists, the cultural practitioners, the musicians. It's to destroy the culture. And we've seen that within this unfolding situation as well. So, I mean, I guess it comes back to we've got to be better advocates in getting the message across that there really isn't a question anymore. Now, some people prefer to use the term cultural genocide. I'm quite happy to use genocide based on what I have seen within the data that's coming out of Beijing from the Chinese themselves. So, yeah.
Yeah, again, I agree very much with what Anna has just been saying. I mean, in my work, I tend to favour the notion of cultural genocide, mainly as a way of getting around this question. If you speak to MPs and so on, if you use the word genocide, of course, the immediate thought is the Holocaust. And then they'll say, well, essentially, where are the dead bodies, right? The problem with what's happening in the Uyghur region is that we don't actually have evidence of mass killing. And from my view, that actually is not an issue, because the processes that are involved, this is what Anna has touched upon, is these processes demonstrate the ultimate objective. The ultimate objective is cultural erasure, if you will. It's about breaking down key markers of Uyghur identity, whether that's language, whether that's religious observance. It's about destroying cultural reproduction. So hence you have children being removed from or being removed into state care while their parents are sent to re-education. It's got to do with the birth control policies and so on. So these are things in process. So genocide is a process. It's not something that happens sort of here and ends here. It's a long-term process. And it's sometimes, I think, difficult for politicians, but also for the general public to sort of get that framework right, because everybody immediately thinks genocide, that means gas chambers in Nazi Germany. So it's something that scholars of genocide have been grappling with for a long time as well.
Well, my name is Dolkun Isan from the World Uyghur Congress. Thank you all panelists and particularly to camp survivors. Well, I travel a lot with camp survivors, Ömer Bekir, some other camp survivor, all the time. And all the time, I heard several times this horrible story, horrible experience in the concentration camp. When every time I heard this horrible story, I felt so sad. I couldn't find myself because my mother died in one of the concentration camps in 2018, and still my two brothers in the concentration camp. So if I heard the story, I immediately think of my mother's. And what kind of such a horrible situation in 17 years old lady died in one of the concentration camp. So I couldn't find myself. I felt so sad, and I cannot concentrate myself at least a couple of hours, you know. So you constantly talking the story all the time. How you can encourage yourself? How you can find yourself? Where you can find this power? This is my question. Thank you.
Rahmet okuyun zaten. Biz şu kamplardan kaçıp kurtulmadan ki bana 3 yıl kaldı. Kimler bileylerde bu uğurdan zulmünü anısını tutuklanmamız yok. Bizim kullanılan nurgun halkımız var. Şu muhalefet yaşarken nurgun halkımız biz için halk dua kılan isil insanlarımız var. Bunların şu isil sözleri, medetleri, ilhamlarımız, özümüzde güç toplarımız bunlarda. Bu münasebetler şu kalbi güzel insanlarımızın rahmet etme. Ondan keyin benim şu olan yerde bir kızım var. Ben şu yana kaçıp çıkamışım var. Bütün şu kızım asas konumuna değil. Ben bütün ümidimle şu kamplarda turga vaktinde hiç kanda ümit yok çeteldi çıkayız. Allah'ın üzülgen şu vaxtıda mı? Ben bir gün mutlak bağım yok. Şu arzum. Çünkü kızımı görüşüm gerek. Ben kızım bağışladı. Kızım için ben yaşayayım gerek de. Ondan için yaşayıp geldi. Kızımın ilhamı da toplar.
I have, it's been 3 years since I've left, and I haven't stopped sharing my story. I constantly think about my people back home who are suffering in these camps, and I find my strength in my community. My community is composed with many brilliant and extraordinary people who have been supportive and who are supporting each step that we take. So I want to thank these incredible people and my community. And when I was in the camp, my only hope was my daughter, my only daughter, who actually saved me. And the only hope that I had, and the only motivation, and the only way I looked forward and I went forward was my daughter. The thought of seeing her one day gave me strength.
Ben bir 3 balının dadısı, ailemde hayatta bulgan işenç, meni her vakit bu lagerdeki azat okubatlarını toxtamay sözlep, suda akkan insanımı kutlaşka tırışıp, kırdak karab üzüdü, her kandan boran çapkın, suğa ısıtkaga insanımı şuna yengişke tırışıdı. Men bir erkek, bunu sütütüm bilen, o benim ailem. Vatanimdagi bu zulmet, bu qirg'inchiliklarni to'xtatish uchun ularni qo'llash va ularni quturishga o'zimizni bag'ishlash bu bir kishilik majburiyatimdan qarayman. Shu sababdan men hayotga bo'lgan ishonchim to'xtamasdan olg'a bosishga va ularni quturishga harakat qilishga undaydi meni.
I am a father of 3 children. I have a family, and I have confidence in life. I have love for life as well. And I believe that in even the most difficult circumstances, you can survive anything if you believe in yourself and in life and the people around you. And as a man, I am deeply committed to my family, and I have obligations. And it is my sense of responsibility towards my family and community that keeps me going.
Thank you, first kiddo from the Slavery Free. And thank you so much to the panelists, and particularly those who shared your story, because We can see statistics, we can see reports, but when you come and tell your story, it's human to human. That's the struggle that we have when we're working with government departments. And Ramilla, you will remember well when we appeared before the inquiry last year, where the two major departments at that time, and there is change, but at that time said, well, we can't tackle this because we are country and product agnostic. And we said, what the hell does that mean? Like, you don't believe in countries? You don't believe in products that are coming from these countries? So one of the things that we understand from a lot of our campaigning and trying to present the issues of the Uyghur people is that it is story that connects with people. Whenever we talk to Uber drivers and taxi drivers, when we talk to a lot of businesses, they know that it's there, but most times they don't know what to do. And most times it's like that China does that. We've seen them do it in Tibet, we've seen them do it to their own people in their history. It's almost like, well, yes, we can understand that can happen because China does those things, and there's been a history of that. It is a part of the mentality and their culture to use power in those particular ways. And so government takes so much time, and government to government is about diplomacy, and diplomacy is the art of compromise. And so I'd be really interested in your response in the other area, and we were in Canberra this week as well. I think we were crisscrossing each other through Parliament House. But what came up again was the the forced labour amendment. And so we're involved with that and helping to bring that in and informing the people that were presenting that. Again, another different party now, not Rex Patrick and not Rebecca Sharkey. And so I guess the question I'd like to ask you is, in understanding that's what happens in government, and it takes so long for governments to bring about that change, is what's the other pressure on government, which is trade. And so the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act in the USA, which our colleagues and the people as lawyers in USA say probably the most radical act brought into the USA in the last 100 years. This has got the one presented this week is going to go, of course, through the Senate. We do believe the Liberals are going to back it, which is a turnaround for them. But I guess the question is, how effective do you think forced labour acts? I mean, not only is it a genocide, it's also slavery. And so the big thing I think that we want to say is, what's the other strands, and how effective do you think forced labour bills, as it's coming into Canada as well now, as it's coming to Japan, it's coming to the EU, it's coming into the UK, it's coming in here, New Zealand will be looking at it also. How effective do you think the forced labour acts coming in are really going to be there? Because in academia, yes, it is a small readership. It can inform other people, but trade is something that affects. It is the economy. And once you work in the economy, there's all sorts of other ears that seem to open. So my question is, how effective do you think these acts could be?
Yeah, so I'll go a little first. I suppose the first one is about Australia, and the second question is more about the international side of the dimension. For the Australian side, I mean, he's probably aware of, as you mentioned, about I suppose that how slow the wheels move in Canberra. The only way to keep those wheels moving, or perhaps speed them up, is to keep doing what activities that are being done at the moment in terms of this advocacy. The other one is, and this is a difficult one in the Australian context, is finding champions within the system, whether that's particular MPs or a particular minister, or a senator or so on, to actually champion these things through the process. In terms of the bigger question about internationally, I think what the United States has done has obviously been at the sort of leading edge of this, and it seems to be slowly seeping out into other parts of the world. But the bigger issue, I think, and this is something that the Australian side is how you disentangle supply chains. How do you actually do an accounting for this? How do we know that particular products are made or have been made with the use of Uyghur forced labour? There are ways to do it, but it's very difficult, time-consuming. It impinges on attention spans within government, resourcing, and so on. So I think that's one of the really big issues moving forward is how you actually develop a transparent accounting system for looking at where these supply chains come from. The other one, in terms of the issue about the economy, is how do you engage, for instance, corporate Australia, even beyond that, in the corporate world? How do you actively engage with them to say this is actually important, this has ramifications for reputation, certainly corporate reputation. There were some issues around, was it the garment company? The name of the company, there was reputational damage associated with that. So there's useful examples that advocates can point to and say, look, if you're certainly, corporate Australia anyway is big on, social responsibility and so on. It's like, well, okay, if that's for real, then you actually have to seriously look at this. Because not only contains reputational damage for you as a brand, it also impinges on your claims about being a socially responsible corporate citizen as well.
Yes, I think if it is fully implemented, this Forced Labour Act, so the Act can exist, but no government will implement it, fully. So we are working very hard to make sure that this law is implemented fully. So therefore, if it is implemented fully, then it will have some effect. But also, it needs a international coordination. So without international coordination, I also indicated in my remarks that otherwise it will be used as dumping areas for these products. So therefore, there should be an international coordination and to implement this Forced Labour Act. I think it is, as you indicated, a very important act, a very important law, because when we were lobbying for this passage of this law at the U.S. Congress, we are always confronted with the other side, which was very big companies like even Apple, there was there on the corridor. They were also working very hard to convince the lawmakers not to pass this law. So that means it is very important. And recently, the commissioner, PBS commissioner, the U.S. commissioner, made a statement and said that this law has been implementing very, smoothly. That means they have been very successful. And U.S. government also, administration also allocated a lot of money and hired more than 200 employees to monitor the implementation of this law.
And I think also the point about having champions is really important, because in the US, Marco Rubio was relentless, and so he's really driven this issue. He's really pursued it to have a multi-pronged strategy, and I think that's what's required too. Many different approaches, and it needs to be relentless, and you really need people driving it. And in the United States, they are aided by the Congressional Executive Commission of China, so that really helps them to be able to cement their approach in getting these kinds of things, the awareness, the advocacy, the action into play. We don't have a similar, organisation here.
Hi, my name's Sophie from Deakin, just a researcher from Deakin University. Your point there brings me to a question: are we missing organisations in Australia that could really bring such important issues to our country to the forefront? Because it feels like there's a major gap and not only the media maybe being affected by sharp power, or institutions being affected by sharp power to prevent more broad discussion of this. Is there an organisation that needs to be established rather than more inward related interparliamentary group on human rights, which is inward related, and also with the failure of the UN in terms of sharp power in that environment? Is it time to move and create some more organisations in this country?
It's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer though. Look, I mean, you could say yes, there is a need for some kind of advocacy organisation, but I think what Anna has just hit up on in terms of the US context is the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, as well as the way in which the congressional staffs operate, is just so fundamentally different to what happens in Canberra. There's a lack of specialisation across parliamentary staff in this context. For some of them, it's not even on their radar. So the issue is actually getting this advocacy going so it does become on their radar. So it is a consistent factor that pops up for them in their sort of day-to-day work. And I think that's kind of where this issue still is, unfortunately, even after 5 or 6 years. There are sort of peaks of interest from people in government, from MPs and so on, but it waxes and wanes depending on the news cycle, essentially. So the issue is to try and get that sort of a more level sort of attention spans, perhaps even on an upward trajectory. And it is difficult to do that in our system. And look, there are organisations, individuals, researchers that are trying to do this. ASPI's done some great work on this and is still doing some great work on tracking various aspects of what's happening in the Uyghur region, as are academics. But that's only sort of one set of voices, really. The issue is that focus in Canberra. But on the positive side of the equation, I would say that Canberra, there is strong bipartisan support across both major political parties, and indeed I think a lot of the independents in the Senate as well, of an awareness of a need to do something vis-a-vis China. Now the question is what that something is, and this is where things tend to break down. But there is, I think, a level of goodwill and awareness there that can be built upon.
Hi, my name is Rina. I'm from Azerbaijan community. Because I lived in that region for 20 years, I'm born in Azerbaijan. It's the Uyghur nation, they've been massacred by Chinese government, and the many of them at the moment dying. The same happened in Azerbaijan during the Soviet Union. And the story, not the story, history, which we, Azerbaijan citizens, didn't know about it, because it was all covered up. When you mention about mass grave, we have a lot in our country. And only now, after, we can say approximately over 100 years, we get gradually, our government reveals that mass graves. And the way I can see it, the way I lived there, and I can see all around the region, Turkic nation being massacred. And it's not, they massacred mostly because they're being Turk. And it's not only about the Uyghurs. There is in Kazakhs, in Uzbekistan, in Azerbaijan, they are in Iran, Azeri people also being massacred because of being Turks. And why I'm telling that, because of the lady, the way she mentioned, it's really not efficient enough international world. We need really strong organization to stop people being massacred. When we had Soviet Union, that was a big wall of China. Not in that case, of like nobody knew what's happening in Soviet Union. But there's a history constantly being Azeri people, Azerbaijani people being massacred. And in Kazakhstan the same, in Uzbekistan the same. And can we consider, the world can consider really strong organization to stop the people massacre? It's not just how it can be done, but through just the one country, one sanction, another country sanction, but people dying. What can we do? How can we prevent that? How can we help?
Well, we are supposed to have those organisations. That's the United Nations and the United Nations Human Rights Council and the United Nations Security Council. Unfortunately, they're not working. And that's why I talked about the UN Human Rights Council, because I think it's seriously compromised now because of Belt and Road Initiative funding. So that economic coercion, it needs more attention, because this is the other thing many states are just turning a blind eye to, and we have a complete process of dismantling all of those international institutions that were set up after World War II that said never again, but they fail again and again. And this is even more grievous in that not only is it failing, but it looks like it's been completely bought on the inside by Belt and Road Initiative money. So this is a escalation of that process. So we're supposed to have, but they're not working, and they have a track record too of failing. And if you think of the Rwandan genocide, they argued over whether it was a genocide as people being slaughtered in a physical genocide. So there seems to be an issue that the international community is really challenged to be able to respond to. And if you think back to past genocides as well, I mean, even in the Nazi Holocaust, people questioned for years whether the Jewish people were being exterminated. And people even, at the end of the war, who still questioned whether it happened. People saw the camp footage of the camps and said, I don't believe that happened. They're still denying. So it's just, it's a frustration. It is a really frustrating thing to be involved in, because it does feel like one step forward and then 10 steps backward. But we are supposed to have those organisations, but they're not working. And so one of my suggestions for the Human Rights Council is it's time for them to put forward another resolution that seeks members to reaffirm their commitments to the Human Rights Council and the underpinning foundations of the Human Rights Council. Now, they did that in 2003, and it's really to test the member states. Now, if you have a failed vote on that, where member states aren't even reaffirming their responsibilities and remit of the Human Rights Council, we know that that organisation is seriously compromised. So I would challenge the Human Rights Council to put forward that kind of resolution. They did it in 2003. I think it's time to do it again, and to flush out member states who do not support the work and the remit of the Human Rights Council that they are a member of.
Hi, my name is Chandala. I just have one question. It's about the media's role about spreading the news. Like, for example, when any other war happened, it was so over the news, and everybody knows about that. It's like not only the academic or the person working with, but the Uyghurs community is genocide. It's never in the news. It's like nobody knows except me. I have a master's in social work, like finished it, and I didn't know until I started to work with these terms. Do you think is it another form of Islamophobia, or what do you think about that?
Well, in Australia, there's been a lot of work done on the ABC. So there's been a lot of reports on the ABC about this, but not so much on the mainstream channels, but certainly on the ABC, there's been a lot of reports, and the community here in Australia opened themselves up again and again to sharing their stories and telling their experiences. And I think on the ABC, it's been like a saturation almost. But it's not picked up outside of that. And most people, you know, we'd love them to get their primary news from the ABC, but unfortunately they're not. So that's the challenge as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But the other issue as well, this is something that I think has hindered, and I think you probably know this more about this, but certainly in the way in which the Chinese government has framed its narrative around what it's been doing in the Uyghur region, around this idea of counter-terrorism and counter-radicalisation, actually has had an effect in some contexts. And I would say even here in Australia, certainly early on, you would go to events and people would go, oh, well, but aren't they just, you know, they're just doing what we would do in countering extremism. And so you have to break down that kind of sort of initial stereotype in a way before you can actually even get the narrative in there and say, okay, well, actually, you need to listen to what's happening, certainly to individuals like our survivors here as well. And this is kind of the key issue, is getting the message out in ways that are easily digestible to people. Certainly, if we're dealing with commercial media, you know, the big television networks in this country. I mean, you're talking about really short, you know, sound bites. Unfortunately, is trying to frame the issue that people will actually recognise and say, oh yes, this is what's happening in Xinjiang, this place I've never heard of before, is actually really bad, and it's important that we do something about it. It's a difficult task, but it's something that has to be done.
Yes, I think especially in Muslim majority countries, there were some instructions from the government to the media, mainstream media, to not cover Uyghurs. So they have contacted several TVs or newspapers, and they openly, some of them openly told us we cannot do anything, because if I write an article, it will not be published. It will, I will risk to lose my position. So therefore, there was an instruction from the Muslim majority country, Muslim majority from the government, not to cover this issue. But of course, because of the social media, now many people, many Muslim populations, and all countries know a little bit what's happening. Started to find out the facts, and therefore there are some movements in Muslim countries as well to support the Uyghurs. But in government levels in the West, nobody can say that we don't know. So it's very different from during the World War II, the people said, oh, we don't know. But everybody knows, because this repression, this Chinese persecution of Uyghurs are so obvious, and it is scope and scale so big, so even Chinese government couldn't hide it. At the international community, they know, but the thing is, they have not taken any strong action to stop this.
And I think too, the Muslim majority countries just falling into line with Beijing's rhetoric, even saying, this is counter-terrorism. I mean, Saudi Arabia said that, Pakistan. I mean, think of Imran Khan, who are the Uyghurs, I don't know anything about them. Just extraordinary. So then that actually breathes new life into Beijing's rhetoric on this, because then people are able to say, well, the Muslim countries, they don't really find a problem with this. So that then reinforces the narrative from Beijing. And that's a shocking indictment on those countries. It really is a shocking indictment on them. And if they, most of them too, have Belt and Road Initiative agreements. So
So we of course, we have been traveling to many Muslim majority countries to advocate on behalf of the Uyghur and educate the people what's happening. So I think we face the biggest difficulty in Muslim countries to convince them. They confronted us, no, you are lying. But in Western countries, nobody told us, you are lying. But maybe they were a little bit suspicious about our accounts, but still they listened to us, But in Muslim majority countries, big Muslim organization, they confronted us. They said, you are lying. This is not true. Because Chinese authorities invited many people, delegation from Muslim majority countries, and they fooled them. It was a stage visit, so maybe they didn't know, but they find out that the reality they couldn't bear to write. And I visited Malaysia and Indonesia. There were some journalists, and they told us that my report was different, but I couldn't convince our editor to publish it.
And there have been journalists in those countries who have written reports. And in Dawn in Pakistan, the newspaper, one woman wrote, it's Ramadan and we just want to fast like you. So, there's been some really interesting pieces as journalists have tried to get that message across. And also in Pakistan, there are quite a few Pakistani men whose wives and children disappeared into camps. So that has been an ongoing news story in Pakistan, and those men are not going to go away because their wives and children went missing.
Hello, my name is Mehmet from the Uyghur communities. I just have a simple question. Actually, it's not a question. I just want to ask any simple recommendation for our people. And our people in Sydney, we have just maximum 500, maybe 600 population in total. We have a very small population. And we came, most of us came in the last 20 years. And first we had some difficulties and applying for protection visas, and then after 6-7 years hard work, and most of us feel free and also physically free, and also financially became almost independent. But unfortunately, these Chinese crazy government, Xi Jinping, started the genocidal policies because of his Belt and the Road Initiative project, and influencing the whole world, and also the East Turkestan, as it is in the very pivotal point in the Central Asia. It is the last export. Actually, it is the last gate to the Western world. So they started destroying our people, and the genocide is happening, happening, and we lost communication with our family, relatives. I have, for example, four sisters. I don't have any connection with them in the last 6 years. Although we are physically free and happy here in this country, but because as a human, as we came from that country and we were born in that country, we are spiritually very disturbed, very stressed. Thanks to some organizations in Sydney, like STARTS, for example, one of the important personal loan is here. She was supporting our communities spiritually and also some financially. So we got some support from the Australian small organizations and some government organizations. But unfortunately, the Australian government is turning blind eye to the genocide. I accept that one because the governments around the world definitely they think about their money first. So my question is, we have been, to be honest, although we are very happy here physically and also financially, most of us because we are very hard-working people. Although our street is very short here, but most of us have our houses and something like that. That means we are financially, we don't have any problem. We are not any problem for the government as well. But we are very, very disturbed spiritually. We have been also trying. We have been trying all our efforts to just draw attention of the Australian government, but somehow our efforts was somehow not successful. So, do you have any, especially Michael, Professor Michael and Anna? Thanks for your very deep research speech. And I'm very thankful to you guys. Do you have any just simple solution or recommendation for our communities, small communities, just to make us or to make the art issues further understood by the known to the Australian government, something like that? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I think you communicate a frustration that many of us have, and I think we need to look at strategies that worked in the past, perhaps, and look at how strategies were able to be developed. And so the one that really springs to mind is apartheid in South Africa. And so what were the effective strategies deployed within Australia that finally got action with regards to apartheid? I mean, I'm thinking more and more that I just feel like I'm a bit rudderless. I need some sort of strategy that has been tried before and draw on it. So, I mean, that was multifaceted. That involved public advocacy. It involved a concerted international effort, though. That was the other thing. So, how do we build that momentum? And I guess it is like Michael said. We are still at that advocacy stage. So, I guess the question is, how do we go to the next step here within Australia? But we have to not only do efforts within Australia, but they have to connect into larger efforts as well. Because when it came to apartheid, that's what worked in the end. It was a whole bunch of people globally coming together and saying, okay, enough's enough. So we've got to work on our strategy.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Anna's just said. The issue is really, I suppose, building up a big enough mass of activity and advocacy, certainly within Australia, but nationally as well. So sort of the apartheid example is a really good one because a lot of it was grassroots driven. Civil society organisations, human rights NGOs, labour unions as well, international labour organisation, for instance, being heavily involved in various aspects of boycotting of South African exports and so on. It's those kind of activities that will get traction. I mean, as we know, and we spoke about this and others have noted this at length, is how governments move so slowly. But a way in which to get governments to move faster is if civil society actors are actually starting to do more and pushing government in certain directions. It's a big task, but I don't see any other option, unfortunately. Is there one final question, and then I think we're really out of time after that.
My name is Ahmed Ali. I'm working in store. Afghanistan this one. Yes, I'm working in store. Afghanistan and China is neighbor. Between Afghanistan and China is the border. In this place, the news, Taj Qurban, it's belong to China. Do you know in Afghanistan? In Afghanistan is now it's Taliban command. And Taliban is very rude people. They don't allow women to go out to school or going to work. And also the children, I think the guards don't allow to go to school. And in this case, Taliban, supported by some Arab group. Here is two groups from Evo. One group is 150 is living in Badakhshan. They are with family. And one group, another group is 80 family living in Florida, in Maidan. They are the airport group, very rude and very killer people. 2 months ago, between people in Badakhshan, they want to ask the government to release the school for girls, but government asked from the airport group to invade these people. They killed the people. They killed all many things on the face of these people. I want from airport people sitting here. I know the person between Professor and the other woman sit. He is coming from cultural revolution in Afghanistan. He learned school and finished. I don't think he finished school or not, but he learned Farsi, and no one is asked for him to go to kill the people. But now the Taliban collect the airport people and collect the Lashkar-e-Taiba and Ansarullah from Tajikistan and 22 other terrorist groups. They are coming in Afghanistan. They are support the Islamic regime in Afghanistan. I ask from airport people, do you want like this Islam and you are airport or atheist?
So I couldn't fully understand what your question, but as far as I know, we had I had direct contact with the Uyghur community in Afghanistan. So the Uyghur community being considered as vulnerable population in Afghanistan now because of the Taliban. So we even have been trying to get out these people from Afghanistan. I'm not aware of any Uyghurs, dealing with that, with what you have been saying to be part of that, terrorist groups or this is something that China is trying to make. Maybe you are aware that even the Chinese group were detained by the former Afghan government because they were trying to set up an organization, an Uyghur, on the name, an Uyghur organization in Afghanistan. But they were detained even by the Afghan government, by Ashraf Ghani. So I don't know how you are getting where you are getting all these information.
Ashraf Ghani time is finished.
Yeah, I know, but I say that.
Yeah, well, we can get into the more complex debate of that because it is complex area. Firstly, sorry, we are out of time, unfortunately. I'd like to just a couple of things before we go. This is working, obviously. We did hold a briefing in the New South Wales Parliament a couple of months ago, and some of you were here when we did that, and we had 15 state MPs at that briefing, and I would love at some stage after the next state election to hopefully even get Michael and Anna back, because I thought your presentations were amongst this presentation from everybody, including those very brave people from that have come from detention in those concentration camps that have managed to survive. Has been one of the best I've ever heard in the Parliament. So we know we have a core group of 15 MPs that have come in the New South Wales Parliament, and it's a matter of keeping up the struggle with them. Also, Michael mentioned the international labour organisations. Don't underestimate how important, when it came to South Africa and apartheid, how important the trade union movement and the international labour organisations were. And if you are a member of your trade union, you should go and talk to the secretary of your union or your delegates and ask for them to, they are a global network of organisations that have a strong commitment, particularly to issues such as modern slavery and forced labour, and they have access to the chain of supply to find out the information on where products are coming from, and they're a very important resource as well are most global organisations. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. It has been important, and I know it was short notice, and unfortunately we're in the campaign period, so it's a very difficult time of year. But in particular, I'd like to thank Sېdnìyդىkي and Omar, who have come so far to address both our parliament and the federal parliament on behalf of the Uyghur people. And I can assure you, your message will not go unheard in the New South Wales Parliament. Thank you to Omar, also from the World Congress, for coming, and to Anna and Michael for your presentations. Someone has Michael's book here. I don't know whose copy it is, but I'm stealing it. And I will try and actually get some copies of that book and get it to the MPs that actually came to our briefings as well, because I think that they will be interested, particularly interested in what's in there and the way that you can actually articulate the process that is happening here. So thank you to the organisations that came and helped. By the way, if there's scones out there, please try and take them on the way out, because as I've already said, I always get left with hundreds of scones and a cup of tea. And I'm sure if people want to continue to talk, you can grab people outside. By the way, if you can't get up the stairs, if you go to your right where the mirrors are, those doors will automatically open, and there is a lift. So use the lift if you have trouble with the stairs. And if the tea and coffee is still there, yes, if the tea and coffee is still there, you can grab some more of those and the scones. And I'm being shown another book, which is called The China. Right, The China Freedom Trap, the story of the Uyghur fighting Chinese, well, it's about the World Congress. I'm getting my neck whispering in my ear. I should have it in the Parliament every time I'm making a speech, really. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and particularly those that have come so far. Let's give them a big round. Well, I've got to go and translate.
Yeah.
I just want to see. No, that's true. Try and see James. Alright, you go, dismissed.
Yes.
I got more of
Masturada, sumpam aldınız mı? Hem bak.
Assalomu alaykum, hurmatli televideniyechilar. Dunyo Uyg'ur Qurultoyi to'rt televiziyasındagi Meydan programmasiga xush keldinglar. Kichik texnik sabab tufaylidan hozir biza vaqtlarni qo'ydik. Biz bugün Avustralya'daki Sydney şehrindeki parlamentida Dünya Uyghur Kurultayı rehberleri, şundaqla kamp şahitleri, hürmetler Kazımır Hanım, şundaqla Ömer Bekri, efendilerle guvahlıqni bir yerda anlap ötdük. Bu Avustralya'daki lager şahitlerinin tuncu qıtımlıq guvahlık veriş bu hesaptı. Lager şahitleri Avustralya'ya tuncu qıtım kelişi. Bu münasebetle lager şahitlerindeki köngül sözünü bu naqmadanın anlaş nayeti zürür dep bildim. Hürmetlik kalbimler sınıp Sıdık Hanım. Ben sizden şu soğanı sonra baksam, siz hazırlıcı 3 yılın jarayonida nayeti nurg'un guvohliklarni berdingiz, nurg'un axborot vositalari bilan ko'rishdingiz. Sizniki shu davlat parlamentlarida qanchinchi qatim guvohlik berishdingiz? Shu esingizda bormi?
Aleyküm assalam, rahmat. Assalomu alaykum muhojirlar barliq qarindoshlar. Rossiya degan o'xshash men nurg'un davlatlarga bordim. Masalan, Germaniya, Bavariya, Berlin, andan keyin Belgiyaga parlamentlarda bo'ldim, Fransiya, Parijda bo'ldim, Yaponiyada bo'ldim. Norvegiya ko'plab bordim. Hukumat organlari bilan ko'rishdim, parlamentlarda guvohliklar bo'ldim.
Men bundan so'radim, siz guvohlik bergan axborot vositalari shundaqla universitet, boshqa organlarni sanab tugatgan bo'lmaydi. Shunda yaqinsiz xuddi bir muqim xizmatchidek hamiyatga guvohlik beryapsiz. Afsuski bizning 12 lager shahidimiz bor, lekin ba'zilarniki qo'lda rasmiyat bo'lmaganligi uchun bir yerlarga berish imkoniyati yo'q. Bu butun guvohlik vazifalarimiz shu Yevropadagi 5 lager shahidiniki zimmasiga yuklangan. Hamda o'sha yerda men shu ishni so'rab qo'ydim. Dunyoning cheti bo'lgan bu Avstraliyaga keldinglar. Nəhayət cəfalı vaxt yoki boshqa jihatlardan 10 necha soat farqli. Sizlarga shunday bir kuchni nima beryapti? Avayimiz savolda so'raldi, lekin bu nəhayət bir jafolarga hech qanday bir sizlarga manfaat bo'lmagan, faqat sizlar qurbonlarga o'zinglarniki butun kuch bilan shu Uyg'urlarning erkin qirg'inchiligini dunyoga to'ntirish uchun bu xizmatni qilyapsiz. Sizga shu kuch nereden keldi?
Rahmat, bu savolni yaxshi so'radingiz. Bu kuch menga shu muhojirat yashayotgan millionlagan shu Uyg'ur xalqimiz va boshqa millat qarindoshlarimizdan bizga bo'lgan madatlari, ilhomlari, nəhayət yaxshi so'zlari, undan keyin xolis duolaridan kelyapti. Men bundan o'zim kuch quvvat olyapman. Undan sirt yana mening o'zim bizim ma'ma her daim medet ve ilham berdi ma'lumot. Bu münasebetlerime yani şu muhaciratki, şunda kalbi güzel qarindoshlarımızdan köp rahmet aytaman.
Sizga köp rahmat. Hamda kamp şahitleri bizniki bunday aytgancha tabarrukimiz nəhayət oz sonda amaliyotda kampda yetib chiqqan lager şahitleri aytdı. Lekin bizniki hozirgacha qo'ng'inimiz faqat bo'ldi. Yana xalqaro e'tirof qilgan yoki Uyg'ur soti guvohlangan faqat 12. Hamda shu Uyg'ur soti boshlash bilan birga sizlarga hurmat sazovor fidokor bizning Uyg'ur xalqiniki faxri shohidlarni hujumlar bo'lyapti. Masalan, Uyg'ur sotidan boshlab avjiga chiqdi bu. Hatto Avstraliyaga kelgich bo'lganlikmi? Masalan, aqllarning narxi bo'lsak so'z shunday gaplar tarqalgan sosyal medyalarda. Ham sizningki Uyg'ur jamoati deydigan mush to'g'riliqlar gapimiz bormi? Biroq avvalganda hamda Avstraliyadagi shunday kelib shunchalar uzun musofirni besib mishga kelib yana hech qanday bir manfaatsiz bir fidokorlikda shunday bir hujumlar uchirsanlar sizlar nima demoqchi?
Ben bütün muhaciratdagi az bir qismi lekin undaq insonlar siz deganga o'xshash London Uyg'ur sotidan boshlandi. Hatto Xitoyning tahdidi, u Xitoyniki dahshat bo'lgandi. Undan u bizga hech qancha kor qilmagan. Amaliyotda shu Xitoyning shu besim tahdidlaridan biz yana o'zimizni kuchlab to'xtatdi. Sen bizga shunday qarshi chiqqan bo'lsang, biz buni jasorat edib, biz sana qarshi texmo guvohlikni kuchaytiramiz deb. Bundan bir kuch kelgandik. Ammo afsus, az bir qismdagi shu Uyg'ur qarindoshlarimiz aksicha shu Xitoy bilan tang o'rnida turib, mush Uyg'ur so'tinimi, hatto Uyg'ur epizodi deb baqdi. Uningdagi biz shu vatandagi shu kompilatorlar bishimiz o'tilgan shu haqiqatni so'zlab olsaqmi, ya'ni bizni bu Xitoy bilan tang Uyg'ur epizodi deb qarayman. Bu guvahlik berganlarimiz artistlar deb baqdi. Bunu masalan Xitoy vatanda qolgan meniki sobiq yo'ldoshimni so'zlatdi, video topatdi buni. Aşını tutib olib, mana yo'ldoshimni so'zlatdi, buning uchun bular yamaydi deb shunaqa so'zlar bo'ldi. Nayt ko'p bunday ishlar. Undan keyin biz shu Avstraliyaga kelishdan burun to'g'ri dedingiz, hammamiz har qaysi davlatlarda intayin yig'ir hisoblanamiz. Keldik, uyqusiz. Undan keyin hammamiz har qaysi yerdan kelgichimi bir ish qitimda kuchanmay qaytib ketib, bir muncha vaqtimiz, zihnimiz Biz sarf bo'ldi, ko'nglimiz shunday yerim bo'ldi, necha kun yana uxlayolmadik. Yana qanday bo'lmasin, jabr jafolar bilan shu keldik Avstraliyaga. Biz yo'l kelayotgandilar, biz shu medialarda, sotsial medialarda bu nimalarni ko'rib, shaxsan bizning ko'nglimiz yerim bo'ldi. Chunki biz bu Avstraliyada qadam bosmay turiblar, u sotsial mediada deyish menimcha qanday maqsad dedi, men hayron qoldim. Bu nima uchun undaq deydi deb mening qallam o'tmagan yeri. Bizga o siz degan o'xshash hech qanday bir manfaat yoki huquq degan narsa bizda yo'q. Biz faqat va faqat shu vatanni bo'layotgan, shu zulmni, shu chorsiz qolgan Uyg'ur xalqimizning beshidagi shu zulmatni anglatish, butun dunyo xalqaro shuni bildirish, shu bir maqsad bor. Biz hech qaysi bir davlatlarga berib, yo bir tashkilot yo derneklardan bizga bir ozroq manfaat deganiki yo boshqa narsa degan maqsad faqat yo'q. Mush munosabat bilan shu ezib qolgan qarindoshlarimni mening deydiganim siz xato qilibsiz. Sizin masalan pullarni yig'ib va yoki boshqa faoliyatlar boshlab degan bo'lsa, shu tashkilotlar o'zi jiroqdan kelgan mush qarindoshlarimizga yaxshi bir kutaylik degan maqsadda degan bo'lishi mumkin. Siz uni xato tushunib, bizga unda zarba bergansiz butunlay xato bu. Shuning uchun buni tuzatishni umid qilman. Ulug' Allohdan sizga qalbingizga bir isloh berishini, vatan millat sevgisi ato qilishini umid qilman. Rahmat.
Ko'pdan ko'p rahmat. Xudoyim hammalarning ko'ngliga insof va hidoyat ato qilsin. Oxirgi savolim endi o'sha Avstraliyagacha keldinglar. Bundan keyingi musobaqalar nihoyat uzun. Mush jarayonda sizlarniki yana qandoq bir ko'nglinglarda orzuyinglar bor. Masalan, shu Uyg'ur so'tiniki jarayonidami sizlar hatto Xitoyga berib, Xitoyning o'zida turib, o'zinglar yotgan, o'zinglar tug'an shu lagerlarda guvahlik berishni BDT talab qildinglar. Necha boshliqninki doklad e'lon qilinishdan burun akam shoirlari guvahlik berdi Janvada. Ham Janvada bir hafta turib namoyish qildinglar. Ham bundan keyingi texnik o'xshamagan bir umidinglar yoki orzuyinglar bormi? Bu to'g'rilikni anlaganingizdan rahmat.
Bu shaxsan mening shunday bir orzuyim bor. Chunki mening Yaponiyaga borgim bordi. Yaponiya xalqi, Yaponiya parlamenti, hukumatı Uyg'urlarni shunchalik qo'llaydiganlarni men bilatdim, qo'llaydiganlar. Yaponiyaga bordim, nurg'un davlatlarga bordim. Endi mening bir orzuyim Amerikaga va Kanadaga berishni orzu qilman. Undan keyin Argentina so'tiniki shu vaqtida ichilib, shu Xitoyni sudga tortishga aşağı boradigan shunda cho'ng orzuyim bor.
Xudoyim hammalarniki yo'lni oq qilsin, texnik kuch-qudrat ato qilsin, ishlarni o'ngishli qilsin. Qimmatli vaqtingizga rahmat. Hurmatli televizor ko'ruvchilar, Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultoyi to'r televiziyasiniki programmasiga xush keldinglar. Hambarlashni va taqitishni unutib qolmasliklarini umid qilamiz. Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultoyi va lager shoirlariniki Avstraliyadagi ziyarati, guvahlıqı bugun 3-kunga qadam qo'ydi. Biz davomli Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultoyi rahbarlari shundaqlar lager shoirlarining oqidan naq maydon programmasi taqitishga eng yangi xabarlarni vaqtida sizlarga sunishga tirishimiz. Allohga omonat. Xush vaqt bo'linglar.